seems that SMSL have now produced so many versions of the SU-9 DAC behind me that they've actually gotten confused themselves about which model's which. Recently, when I was looking up some information for the SU-9 Ultra that I've got here, they had 4 other versions of the SU-9 on the website, not including the Ultra. And then on top of that, when I received the SU-9 Ultra, they're so confused about what's got what in it that the box for the SU-9 Ultra that contains an AKM DAC chip has the logo for ESS on it. That's a competitor logo for AKM, it's the wrong brand entirely, and I don't say that to be super critical because mistakes happen, but my point is that there are so many products coming out of SMSL and Topping these days, both are basically as bad as each other. There's so many coming out of those brands that even they can't keep track of the various model variations and tweaks. And so you might be wondering why I've even bothered to say yes to reviewing the SU-9 Ultra, and it comes down to one very simple reason. And that is that it has the AK4499EX DAC chip that's paired up with the AK4191. They work together as a combo. And I've only heard good things from those DAC chips so far, and I wanted to see if at $500 this could give us an entry point into that sort of performance. As I've been doing in a lot of reviews lately and will continue to do, I'm going to jump straight in and answer that question really soon. But before we do, I want to give you a quick sense of what you're looking at here and a quick sense of what it's packing in terms of features and functions. And then we'll come back at the end and do a more detailed device tour. I'll talk about the interface, the functions, etc. there in a lot more detail. But the quick summary of it is we've got the SU-9 Ultra. It's a $500 or $499 DAC and preamp. It does have volume control. It's packing, as I've already said, the AK4499EX and AK4191 DAC chip combo. And then added to that, SMSL are talking about the fact that they've designed their own clock system, which should improve the sound further. It's known as the CK03 circuit. And all of this comes together in a package which will decode up to DSD512, up to PCM 768 kHz, and MQA if that matters to you. And so knowing all that, the big question is, how does it sound? And the short answer is fantastic. It's a really nice sounding DAC. And when it comes to testing DACs, I always find it difficult to talk about them in isolation, because unless it's a particularly rich or warm or massive soundstage type DAC, there's really not much to say other than it sounds good. But I'm not going to stop there. What I've done instead is compared the SU-9 Ultra here to a couple of other DACs for you. Now, one of the DACs I compared it to was SMSL's own DO300. That's a DAC that I really liked, really respected, but honestly, it didn't stack up to the SU-9 Ultra, so I'm not even going to spend any time on that one. If you happen to be looking at both of those, unless you specifically want the I2S connection that's on the DO300, then there's absolutely no need to spend the extra $40 to get the DO300 because the SU-9 Ultra flat out sounds better. Even when you're using the I2S connection on the DO300, which is its best connection, and the USB connection on the SU-9 Ultra. So I would just bypass the DO300, go straight to the SU-9 Ultra on that one. However, if you've got up to $600 to spend, you might also be looking at DACs like the Topping D70 Pro Sabre and the D70 Pro OCTO. Now, when I reviewed these two, it was the D70 Pro OCTO that was most enjoyable to me, and so I've put that one up against the SU-9 Ultra. The D70 Pro OCTO uses 8 DAC chips from Cirrus Logic, and it comes in at $599, making it about $100 more than you're spending on the SU-9 Ultra. One of the tracks I used for this test was Break My Heart Sweetly by John Morland. From memory, this was from my Patreon Selects playlist, so this is one of the channel patrons that suggested this one. Thank you to whoever it was. And between the SU-9 Ultra and the D70 Pro OCTO, it was a much closer battle than with the DO300. And so this for me is where the SU-9 Ultra really starts to meet its true competition. And that's great news. You've got to spend $100 more than the SU-9 Ultra to really match it for sound quality, at least to the DACs that I've tried. Having said that, they're not exactly the same DACs, that being the D70 Pro OCTO and the SU-9 Ultra. And specifically, what I noticed was that the OCTO had a slightly meatier mid-range to it. It's not a particularly thick or warm sounding DAC overall, but it does have a sense of body to it. And I'd go so far as describing it as like a harmonic richness to the sound. When you hear a plucked guitar or a vocal, it's just got a bit more something going on, a bit more presence, a bit more weight. And that for me does separate it a bit from the SU-9 Ultra, and it is a sound that I personally prefer over the SU-9 Ultra. But I think there's going to be just as many people that prefer the SU-9 Ultra because it probably comes across just a bit more neutral. Many are going to feel like the SU-9 Ultra is the more reference sound, the more truer to source sound, whereas I think the D70 Pro Octo for me sounds a bit more lifelike. That's going to vary depending on you, your preferences and your system though. Where the SU-9 Ultra does have some strengths is because it's got that more kind of neutral sound. It does bring forward sounds like texture in vocals, breath in vocals, etc. And I think also the soundstage is a bit wider from the SU-9 Ultra, and therefore the separation between individual sounds might be just a touch better too. It's not a big separation point, and I think there's just as many strengths for the SU-9 Ultra as there are strengths for the D70 Pro Octo. And indeed for the D70 Pro Octo, just to show that it's not a rich, thick and warm DAC, when I went back over to the D70 Pro Octo, what I found was that it was bringing out a little bit more energy and attack on sounds like a plucked guitar string. So those transients, leading edges of notes, sense of attack, sense of clarity, whatever you want to call it, I think the D70 Pro Octo had a slight edge there, even though it was also a bit weightier through the mids. And so it's going to come down to which one you prefer. As I said, I like the Octo just a little bit better. I also like the interface on the Octo better. I'll talk about the interface on the SU-9 Ultra a bit later. And so as I said, I would choose the Octo, but I think it's going to be kind of a 50-50 split for those that prefer the SU-9 Ultra and those that prefer the Octo. And so just to recap how I would make the decision if I was you, was that if you want to save $100, just buy the SU-9 Ultra. Both DACs are fantastic. But if you like a slightly meatier sound with a bit more presence and then still a good sense of attack and clarity on the leading edges, guitar plucks, drum hits, etc., that's where the Octo's better, I think, and I think the interface a little bit as well. If, though, you're more about a very neutral sound, a very clean and textural sound, and possibly a slightly wider soundstage with slightly better separation, then I think that's where the SU-9 Ultra is the one to choose. And so as you can probably tell at this point, I was really impressed with the SU-9 Ultra, and so I put it up against the very best implementation I've heard so far of the AK4499EX DAC chip, and that was in the Geshelli Labs J2S DAC. The J2S comes in at around about $180 more than the SU-9 Ultra, and I say around about because depending on how you spec the J2S, you can get it in all sorts of different variants. But the one I was particularly testing it with is the AK4499EX DAC chip version that's also running the Spikos Labs op amps. And it's these discrete op amps that normally have been able to separate the J2S from other DACs of similar price and similar quality. And so as you can imagine, I was really interested to see if the SU-9 Ultra could get close to the J2S, maybe even match it, because at $180 less, that would make it excellent value. I mean, it already is excellent value, but that would be the icing on the cake. When I first plugged in the two and switched between them, what I would say is that they sounded very similar initially. However, they weren't exactly the same, and the thing that separated these two was one of those sort of track-to-track things. Some tracks really highlighted it, others not so much. And specifically what was going on was that the J2S had a slight sense of refinement through the mid-range that the SU-9 Ultra couldn't quite match. Now, refinement is not a kind of polite way of saying it was rolled off or smoothed off or lacking in detail. It was just more under control. All of the same details were present, the tonality was pretty much identical, but everything was just easier to listen to through the J2S. It was, as I said, smoother, a little bit richer perhaps, but not warmer, not thicker. Where that also carried into was down into the bass, where the J2S clearly extended deeper in the bass, and also had a bit more impact and a bit more presence in the bass when it needed it. One final strength of the J2S was that its soundstage was also a bit deeper, and therefore there was a greater sense of layering in the soundstage. It was easier to pick out which instruments were behind which other instruments, whether it was pop music, orchestral music, etc. It just laid out the soundstage in a bit more detail. It wasn't a huge shift. Whether it's worth $180, that's going to be a question for you to answer. But to me, the J2S was a clear step ahead, thanks again to those Spikos Labs op amps. Having said that, it only reinforced the fact to me that the SU-9 Ultra is excellent value. For $500, you're getting a magnificent sounding DAC here. It's not quite as good as a DAC like the J2S, but it's also $200 cheaper. And so that brings us around to questions about its interface, its design, its connectivity, to work out if this is a good fit for you. It clearly sounds fantastic, in my mind there's no doubt of that, but it's not going to be the best fit for everybody due to the connectivity limitations compared to say a DO300, and or compared to the look, the feel and the interface. Starting off with a look at the front of the SMSL SU-9 Ultra, and like most SMSL DACs around this price point and below, it's a very basic front panel with what I think is a pretty average control knob. I'm generally not a fan of the SMSL interface, not so much the screen. The display works fine, it tells you what it needs to know, the menu's fairly well laid out, but I really don't like interacting with this control knob setup. It's kind of a thin, kind of not too deep knob there. It's a decent size, but it just feels a bit cheap and a bit crappy in the hand. This front beveled edge, which looks nice because it gives that silver accent on the black, it doesn't feel good. It feels a bit sharp in the hand. Not sharp that it's going to cut, but sharp in the sense that it doesn't feel nice. Beyond that, there's nothing to talk about on the front panel because it's all about this control wheel here, which is your volume control if you're using this as a preamp, and then also your selector for your menu, muting, all those sorts of things. And then we've got the display, which gives you access to all the different features and functions in the menu, and I'll come back to those in just a moment after we look at the back of the DAC. On the back here, things are again very simple. We've got power input, there's no mains power switch on here, so all the power control is just done through that front switch there. We've then got a Bluetooth antenna, we've got optical, USB-C, and coaxial SPDIF. So there's no I2S as I mentioned before, and there's no USB-B if that matters to you. Moving on from there, we've got XLR and RCA outputs, and as I've already alluded to, these can be a variable line output where you have volume control, or they can be a fixed line output at either maximum volume, or if you're running DSD, it will automatically apply a slight cut to prevent any clipping. If you don't know what that means, don't worry too much about it. If you're using DSD and you're not using the volume control, you can just set it to what they call DSD pass-through, and that's going to take care of all of it for you. While we're talking about the XLR and the RCA, another good thing to mention here is that I tested the sound quality of both and they're completely indistinguishable. So if you are wanting to run both a single-ended and an XLR connection to this, it's going to sound just as good from both. And so in terms of connection, design, functionality, etc., as I said, it's a pretty basic DAC, but it does sound excellent. And then the final things you might want to know is what's going on in the menu structure. And there's not a lot to talk about here. You can choose things like which input you're using, of course. You can choose things like which outputs you're using, so you can switch on the XLR or the RCA or both. You can choose whether it's in preamp mode with volume control or if it's bypassing the preamp and just going straight out as a line out. I've already mentioned there's also a DSD mode for the line out, and that's going to just adjust the volume a little bit to make sure you don't get any clipping with DSD. And then beyond that, the only really key feature in here that we haven't seen much of before, if at all, is there is a sound color mode. Now you might immediately say I've seen SMSL DACs with sound color before, and that's true, a number of them have it, but not like this one. This does it differently. In the past, we've had choices like Rich 1, Rich 2, Rich 3, I think Tube 1, 2, 3 was another option in there, and Crystal 1, 2, 3. Those were different types of harmonic distortion, I believe, or maybe other ways it colored the sound. But this one's a bit different in the sense that it's using a functionality of the onboard AKM DAC chips, and it only gives you 4 choices. And it calls it sound color 1 and sound color 2 at 2 different frequency operations. And so apparently the AK4499EX DAC chip, or maybe it's the 4191 part doing this, I haven't looked into that part of it. But either way, this combination of DAC chips can run at 2 different frequencies. And so when you're choosing from the sound colors, there's really 2 variants that's then available at both the frequencies. Now, as I spent some time listening to both of them and flicking through them, I say both of them, as I went through all 4 options with the 2 options at the 2 different frequency levels, I found that there was very subtle shifts, as is often the case with things like filters and sound colors. And by the way, there is a whole separate run of different filter choices within the SU-9 Ultra. I haven't gone into detail there because there's nothing new from what we've seen so many times before. But as is often the case with filters and or sound color modes, the differences are very, very subtle, and so I'm not even going to try and explain what I heard between them. I think in a lot of cases they're a bit irrelevant, they're a bit unnecessary, and the good news is that the DAC sounds fantastic regardless of which sound color mode you use. Now, one final point that I should make, and I often miss this in my reviews because I have a pure desktop setup, is that if you're like me and you don't like using the control wheel on the front of the SMSL DACs, as with all their other DACs, this does come with a fully functional remote control. So you can do all of the things that I've talked about in probably a much better way using the infrared remote control. So that is in the box, it's all included. You don't have to use this control wheel if you don't want to. and that means you've got access to all those different menu functions with a much easier system of clicking up, clicking down, pressing a middle select button, etc. And so rather than dragging this out any longer than it needs to be, I'm going to wrap things up here by saying I think the SU-9 Ultra is a brilliant DAC for the money. I do think if you can spend a bit more, it's worth maybe considering the D70 Pro Ultra, and definitely if you're looking for the maximum sound quality, look at the Geshelli Labs J2S AKM version. That's the AK4499EX version. But if you want to keep your budget to $500 US, I don't know that you're going to find a much better sounding DAC than the SU-9 Ultra here. And so as always, I'll put links down below where you can go and buy the SMSL SU-9 Ultra if you want to. Do remember it's the SU-9 Ultra. Don't get confused by the million other versions of the SU-9 that are out there. And I'll of course make sure that the links I put down below are only to the SU-9 Ultra. So if it sounds like a good DAC to you, click through the links, pick one up for yourself. I hope you enjoy it as much as I have. And as always, I hope this video has been useful and helpful at helping you to make up your mind. If you have found the video useful or enjoyable, then please hit the like button and subscribe and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. For now though, let me leave it to the music. So happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.